West wasn't built on gunpowder alone. It was built on ledgers, on loans, land deeds, and men who learned that control over a county could be bought one signature at a time. Before the Regulators ever drew their revolvers, before Billy the Kid ever carried a warrant, there was the house. Not a home, but an empire. In Lincoln County, New Mexico, the house wasn't made of wood or brick. It was made of monopoly. Its foundation was greed. Its walls were built from corruption and fear. And its architects were three men: Lawrence Murphy, James Dolan, John Riley. Irish immigrants turned merchants, soldiers turned profiteers, partners in one of the most ruthless cartels the frontier would ever see. They came west under the flag of enterprise, but stayed under the banner of power. They owned the store, the bank, the contracts, the law, and soon enough, the sheriff himself. To do business in Lincoln, you went through the house, or you didn't do business at all. The locals called it a store. The people who understood called it what it was: a kingdom. From its counters, debts were written like sentences. Credit was offered to ranchers who could never pay it back. Their cattle and land eventually seized in the name of repayment. Murphy and Dolan closed soldiers, sold whiskey to outlaws, and buried competition beneath a pile of legal writs and paid deputies. When a young English rancher named John Henry Tunstall dared to open a rival store, the house decided to collect, not with invoices, but with bullets. Tonight, we open the record on the men who ran Lincoln County before the shooting started, the kings behind the curtain, because if the Regulators were born out of vengeance, the house was born out of greed. And before Billy the Kid became a legend, he was simply one more pawn trapped inside their game. And the game where the rules were written by the rich, the sheriff held the cards, and the deck was stacked from the start. The case of the house is now before the court. Hey, Angela, how's it going?
Hey, John, I'm good. How are you?
I'm good, yeah. Trying to kind of get back into the swing of things a little bit, so that's good.
Soggy raining out there.
Oh, it is freaking pouring today.
Yeah.
So I have to note before we jump into this episode, somebody watched.
Somebody
Doesn.
did.
And unfortunately, I was dealing with the hospital and the light flights and all the nonsense, so I didn't really get to talk to you about it. So
Because I refused to make that important over your family's medical business. Come on.
I'm dying to know. What are your thoughts?
It was good. I liked it. I'll watch it again.
Yeah?
Yeah. I did crochet while I watched it,
Well, I expected that.
but I did watch it, and I will watch it again. So, yeah.
It's freaking.
I have now watched Young Guns. Let it be known.
Now we got to work on Young Guns 2.
Yeah, we almost did, but we didn't have time.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
yeah, it's on there. It's on there.
Cool. So now maybe you'll kind of get some of my references.
Yeah. I was actually getting them while I was watching it. I was like, wonder if this would be better had I have watched it before this. Because I knew what was coming and I knew who the people were.
Right?
And Shandy's like, are you sure you haven't watched this? I was like, well, but in the office I have. Because John's almost all played it out. So
Yeah. Pretty much.
that's pretty much how it went.
Yeah.
I was like, I know what's happening. I know who that is. I didn't, whatever.
Well, that's cool. That must mean I'm doing an okay job of
Yeah.
my description.
Yeah.
So,
That's also why I watch movies before I read the book, because it irritates you when you read the book, then watch the movie, and you're like, they left this out, and this out, and this out.
Oh, I know. And it's always
So-
a lot that they leave
Yeah.
out. So,
I always watch the movies before I read the book.
yeah. All right. Well, welcome back, listeners, to Dark Dialogue, Gallows, and Gunfights, the show where the Old West takes the witness stand and history itself is cross-examined under oath.
This isn't the cowboy story they sold in theaters. No white hats, no guaranteed heroes, just the raw truth of power, corruption, and the blood that bought control of an entire county.
Exactly. Before the Regulators rode for vengeance, before Billy the Kid ever fired a shot, there was the house, a machine run by men who treated Lincoln County like their own personal empire. Murphy, Dolan, Riley, They didn't just sell goods, they sold justice to the highest bidder.
And the people who couldn't afford to buy in paid with their land, their cattle, or their lives. What started as business turned into tyranny, and Lincoln became less of a town than a company store with a jail attached.
But tonight, the curtain pulls back. We'll meet the men behind the house, the alliances they built, the laws they broke, and the greed that turned the New Mexico territory into a powder keg waiting to blow.
If you're listening on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or YouTube, take a second to like, follow, or leave a review. It really does help us more than you know, and it keeps the frontier open for the next case.
And don't forget to share the show with someone who still believes the Old West was simple, because they're about to find out just how complicated justice really was.
Court is in session.
Let's introduce the house. Every empire starts with one man who decides the rules no longer apply to him. In Lincoln County, that man was Lawrence G. Murphy. He didn't build his power with a gun. He built it with paper, signatures, and debt. And before long, every rancher, soldier, and storekeeper in the territory owed him something. Here's how it started. The charge? Building an empire out of hunger and debt and leaving a county drenched in blood. He was the first king of Lincoln County, not crowned by title, but by credit. Lawrence G. Murphy, an Irish immigrant born in Wexford in 1831, arrived in America with nothing but ambition and a soldier's grit. At 17, he joined the U.S. Army, trading famine for a rifle and a uniform. He served across the wild edges of Texas and New Mexico, learning the one skill that would one day make him powerful: logistics. Murphy was no gunslinger. His weapon was supply, his battlefield, the ledger. As a quartermaster during the Civil War, he mastered the art of procurement, how to move food, cattle, and ammunition across the hungry land, and more importantly, how to profit from it. Those who could control the flow of goods controlled survival itself. And when the war ended, Murphy brought that lesson to the frontier. By 1869, he had planted his empire in Lincoln, New Mexico, founding L.G. Murphy and Company. To locals, it was just a general store. To Murphy, it was the cornerstone of domination. He held the supply contracts for Fort Stanton and the Mescalero Apache Reservation, feeding soldiers and settlers alike, and charging every rancher in the valley whatever price he pleased. Before long, Murphy's operation swallowed the county whole. Joined by his protégés, James Dolan and John Riley, the enterprise grew into what people would come to call the house. But this was no home. It was a fortress of greed built on inflated prices, impossible debts, and political corruption so thick it stained the very badge of the sheriff's office. Murphy owned the store, he owned the bank, he owned the law, and anyone who dared challenge him, from a struggling rancher to a rival merchant, faced ruin or worse. When John Tunstall, a young English rancher, and his ally Alexander McSween, a lawyer tired of Murphy's monopoly, opened a competing store, Murphy saw more than business competition. He saw insurrection. And in the West, rebellion wasn't handled in court. It was handled with rifles. Murphy's men, deputies, rustlers, hired guns, carried out his will. Contracts became warrants. Commerce became war. The result was one of the most violent feuds in frontier history, the Lincoln County War. Murphy himself would not live to see its end. By 1878, his body was failing, ravaged by cancer, and as the bullets flew across Lincoln, Murphy retreated to Santa Fe, transferring control of the house to Dolan. He died that October, his empire intact, his reputation in ruins. The verdict of time? Lawrence G. Murphy was the architect of the house, a man who built wealth from rations and power from desperation. To some, he was a businessman, disciplined, shrewd, and visionary. To others, he was a tyrant in a merchant's coat, a man who bled Lincoln County dry with a smile and a handshake. He never drew a gun in anger, yet his pen signed the orders that sparked a war. He never stood in the street at high noon, yet his ambition pulled the trigger on a generation of violence. History's verdict is this: Murphy didn't just control Lincoln County, he created the system that corrupted it. His empire of debt and influence set the stage for the Regulators, for Billy the Kid, and for the chaos that would define the New Mexico territory. The man who taught the frontier how to sell justice never learned how to buy peace. And just to note, he did not get shot in the forehead in the middle of the freaking street by Billy the Kid as he rode into the sunset. Yeah. He died of freaking cancer in a much less glamorous fashion. So.
Yeah, my brain was like, I remember something about that being wrong.
Yeah. Reap the whirlwind, Murphy. Okay, so when Lawrence G. Murphy's health failed, the kingdom that he built didn't crumble. It just evolved. Every empire needs a successor, and the house found one in a man who learned its every trick, every ledger line, every backroom deal. James Joseph Dolan. He wasn't the visionary that Murphy was, but he was colder, harder, more willing to draw blood where Murphy preferred to sign papers. Dolan had come west as a soldier too, a fellow Irishman who served under Murphy in the 9th Infantry. But where Murphy built his empire through commerce, Dolan intended to keep it through fear. With Murphy dying in Santa Fe, Dolan took the reins of the house, tightening his grip on Lincoln County like a vice. He controlled the deputies, the courts, and the gangs that did the dirty work in the shadows. He made enemies fast, and he made sure that they didn't live long. If Murphy had built the house with a ledger, Dolan fortified it with a gun. The war for Lincoln County wasn't born in a courtroom. It was born in Dolan's ambition, and it's here that the story turns from business to blood. So let's call the next witness, James J. Dolan. The charge? Turning monopoly into murder and proving that when greed meets power, blood is always the final currency. He called himself a businessman. The people of Lincoln County called him something else. James J. Dolan, the apprentice who inherited the house. Born in County Galloway, Ireland on May 2nd, 1848, Dolan came to America as a child, chasing the same promise that had lured so many of his countrymen: freedom, fortune, and a place to belong. What he found instead was war. At 14, he joined the Union Army, serving until the end of the Civil War. That experience hardened him. A boy molded into a soldier molded into something colder. When the guns fell silent in the east, he followed the scent of opportunity west, landing in Fort Stanton, New Mexico. That's where he met Lawrence G. Murphy, a man twice his age, already a power player, already carving his name into the frontier. Murphy took Dolan under his wing, and what began as mentorship quickly became a masterclass in manipulation. At L.G. Murphy and Company, Dolan learned that control wasn't about guns or gold. It was about credit. If you owned a man's debt, you owned his life. Together with Murphy and John Riley, Dolan helped transform the store into an empire. The one everyone in Lincoln County would come to know, fear, and despise: the house. They supplied Fort Stanton and the Mescalero Apache Reservation, padding contracts, inflating prices, and tightening their grip on every rancher in the valley. Dolan became the enforcer, fiery, proud, and utterly ruthless. He wasn't content to run the books. He wanted to run the territory. In 1873, he nearly shot a Fort Stanton officer during an argument, and when corruption forced Murphy and Dolan out of the fort, Dolan did not retreat. He recalibrated. They reestablished themselves in Lincoln, building their monopoly brick by brick, debt by debt. But then came John Henry Tunstall, young, polished, English, and unafraid to challenge the throne. With lawyer Alexander McSween and cattle baron John Chisholm at his side, Tunstall dared to open a competing store. For Dolan, this wasn't business. It was betrayal. He responded the only way that he knew how, with violence. He financed the Jesse Evans gang, paid deputies to look the other way, and turned the house into a war machine. When Tunstall was ambushed and murdered in February of 1878, Dolan wasn't just behind it, he bankrolled it. That killing and the spark that ignited the Lincoln County War, a feud that would consume 19 lives and drag the territory into chaos. Dolan issued bounties on rivals, hired assassins, and used his political clout to stay untouchable. Even when attorney Houston Chapman, who investigated McSween's death, was gunned down in the street, burned and mutilated, Dolan escaped prosecution. Justice, like credit, was something he'd already bought. When the smoke cleared, Dolan owned what he'd fought for: Tunstall's land, the store, and a political seat. He became Lincoln County Treasurer and even served in the New Mexico Territorial Senate. But victory had its price. The empire he'd inherited turned poisonous. Alcohol dulled his mind, scandal followed his name, and the loyalty that he'd demanded from others dried up with his fortunes. On February 6, 1898, Dolan died at his ranch in Lincoln County, a hollow man surrounded by the ghosts of those he'd buried beneath his ambition. The verdict of time? James J. Dolan was the living embodiment of corruption on the frontier, a soldier turned merchant, a merchant turned tyrant. Where Lawrence Murphy built the house through business, Dolan maintained it through blood. He learned from the best and died by his own lessons. His contracts outlasted his conscience. His empire outlived his honor. And though the records list him as a politician and a rancher, history knows him for what he truly was: the enforcer who proved that in Lincoln County, justice was never blind. It was bought. When James Dolan finally drank himself into obscurity, the empire that he'd fought to keep didn't vanish. It simply changed hands. Every kingdom has its generals, its traitors, and its survivors. And in the house, one man survived them all: John Riley. He wasn't the gunman. He wasn't the mastermind. He was the quiet one, the accountant in the corner who kept the books balanced while the bullets flew. Where Murphy built the foundation and Dolan enforced it, Riley made sure that it never fell apart. He learned early that in Lincoln County, the most dangerous weapon wasn't a Winchester, it was a ledger. Riley stayed calm while Murphy's health failed and Dolan's temper ignited wars. And when both men were gone, he was still standing, holding the keys, the contracts, and the last remnants of the house they'd built on debt, deceit, and blood. If Murphy was the architect and Dolan the muscle, Riley was the one who turned the monopoly into a legacy: cold, efficient, and quietly profitable. He didn't need gun smoke to leave a mark. He let the numbers do the killing. Let's bring the final partner of the house to the stand. The charge? Writing the rules of corruption in ink instead of blood, and proving that silence can be just as deadly as a six-shooter. If the house was an empire, John Riley was the man who made sure the foundation never cracked. Born in Dingle Bay, Ireland in 1850, Riley came to America like so many others, chasing the promise of a better life, only to find himself in a country still bleeding from civil war. He enlisted with the California Column, marching across the Southwest under the Union banner. But when the gunfire stopped, Riley didn't go home. He went into business, and business in New Mexico meant opportunity for the bold and the ruthless. That's where he found Lawrence G. Murphy and James Dolan, two countrymen carving out their own empire in the dust of Lincoln County. Together, they built L.G. Murphy and Company, the mercantile and banking powerhouse that would become known in whispers and curses alike as the House. Where Murphy was the architect and Dolan the enforcer, Riley was the strategist. He was the numbers man, the contract broker, the quiet operator who understood that power didn't just come from bullets, it came from paperwork. He helped secure government contracts to feed Fort Stanton and the Mescalero Apache Reservation, leveraging his connections and legal know-how to turn simple trade into total domination. Credit flowed through Riley's ledgers like blood through the veins, and soon every rancher and merchant in Lincoln County found themselves owing the house more than they could ever repay. Riley's strength wasn't in his aim. It was in his ability to turn the law into a weapon. He twisted credit, manipulated deeds, and bought influence from sheriffs and judges alike. When someone couldn't be bribed, they could always be bled dry by debt. But even men of numbers and ink cast long shadows. Riley's name appeared in more than one gunfight. He was tied to local disputes and suspected in violent confrontations, including the one that left respected citizen Juan Patron badly wounded. To the common settlers of Lincoln County, Riley wasn't just a businessman. He was the face of quiet cruelty, the kind that smiled while taking your last dollar. When John Tunstall and Alexander McSween opened their rival store in 1877, Riley stood squarely behind Murphy and Dolan. He kept the accounts balanced, the bribes flowing, and the deputies loyal, all while the killing began. And when Tunstall fell in 1878, murdered on the open range, Riley's fingerprints were there, not on the trigger, but on the paperwork that made it all possible. The Lincoln County War wasn't just fought in the streets. It was fought in ledgers, in courtrooms, and in the back rooms of Riley's making. He understood what most men never did. The law, in the right hands, do more damage than a Winchester ever could. When the smoke cleared and his partners were gone, Murphy dead, Dolan ruined, Riley did what he always did best. He moved on. He married in Las Cruces in 1882, bought a ranch in Colorado, and lived quietly until 1916 when pneumonia finally claimed him. He died a wealthy man, far from Lincoln, far from the ghost that he helped to create. The verdict of time? John Riley was the last pillar of the house, the man who outlived the gunman and outsmarted the law. He never stood in the street duel, never ordered a posse, and never fired the shot that killed John Tunstall. But he didn't need to. His power was quieter and far more enduring. He proved that corruption doesn't always wear a badge or brandish a weapon. Sometimes it wears a vest, keeps neat records, and smiles across the counter while it takes everything that you own. When the legends of Lincoln County were buried, Riley's name faded from the headlines, but his signature remained on the documents that made the war possible. In the ledger of history, John Riley's balance sheet was full of profit, power, and of blood. Every empire has its generals, men like Murphy, Dolan, and Riley, who made their power visible in stores, in contracts, and in the barrel of a gun. But behind the house stood another figure, quieter, wealthier, and far less exposed. His name was Emil Fritz. He wasn't a gunfighter. He wasn't a sheriff or a politician. He was the money, the investor whose wealth gave Murphy and Dolan the fuel they needed to expand their monopoly and enforce their grip on Lincoln County. Fritz didn't make speeches or lead posses into battle. His power was written in numbers, in banking records, land deals, and silent loans that turned the wheels of the house. When others reached for rifles, he reached for ledgers. But make no mistake, his influence was just as deadly. Without Emil Fritz's financial backing, there would have been no empire to defend, no monopoly to fight over, and perhaps no Lincoln County War at all. Now let's turn the page and call Emil Fritz, the investor in the shadows, to the stand. The charge? Leaving behind not bullets, but a fortune and sparking a war from the grave. Emil Fritz was not a gunman or a lawman. He was a soldier, a trader, and eventually the quiet financier whose money helped build the house. Born in Stuttgart, Germany in 1832, Fritz crossed the Atlantic during an era when opportunity lured thousands of Europeans to America. He spent time in California during the gold rush, then traded his pickaxe for a uniform, joining the Union Army during the Civil War. He rose to the rank of captain, later earning a brevet promotion to lieutenant colonel. His service took him west, where he became a camp commander at Fort Stanton, the very place that would shape his future. It was there that Fritz crossed paths with another young officer who saw the potential of supply and trade, Lawrence G. Murphy. Together, they began as army traders, providing goods for soldiers and settlers. When Murphy's standing with the military soured, he and Fritz left the fort and established their mercantile operation in Lincoln. It was the foundation of what would soon be feared across the territory as the House. Fritz himself wasn't known for violence. His role was quieter, establishing land holdings, building a modest ranch near Lincoln, and ensuring the operation had the stability of capital and contracts. But in a region ruled by debt and dependency, money was every bit as deadly as a Colt revolver. By the early 1870s, Fritz's health began to fail. Suffering from kidney disease and tuberculosis, he returned to Germany in 1874. At just 43 years old, he died far from Lincoln County, but in death, he left behind more than memories. He left an insurance policy worth $10,000, an enormous sum for the time, and it was this policy, not his life, that made Emil Fritz one of the most consequential figures in Lincoln County history. When Alexander McSween collected the payout, he refused to hand it over to Murphy and Dolan, who claimed it as a debt owed to the House. The dispute over Emil Fritz's insurance money ignited simmering tensions, becoming one of the sparks that set off the Lincoln County War. Fritz never fired a shot, never ordered an ambush, and never rode with posses in the night. Yet his death and the fortune that he left behind became fuel for a feud that claimed nearly 20 lives and etched itself into legend. The verdict of time? Emil Fritz was the quietest of the House's founders, a man remembered less for what he did in life than for what his estate triggered after his death. He was a soldier who traded his uniform for commerce, a businessman who partnered with Murphy, and ultimately the financial backbone of Lincoln's most powerful monopoly. But history remembers him as something else, the man who set fire to a powder keg without ever striking the match. His insurance policy became blood money, and his absence helped fuel one of the Old West's most infamous feuds. He lies today in Stuttgart, Germany, far from the dusty crossroads of Lincoln County, yet the shadow of his fortune stretches across the history of the American frontier. By the time Emil Fritz's fortune set Lincoln County on fire, the House had already begun to shift from guns and ledgers to something even colder: paperwork and politics. The power players were dying off, but the money still had to move, and someone had to keep the accounts straight while the bodies piled up. That man was Edgar Walls. He wasn't a rancher, a gunman, or a soldier. He was a banker. One of the few men in Lincoln who understood how to make a killing without ever touching a gun. Walls handled the money, balanced the debts, and made sure that every dollar taken in blood was properly recorded in black ink. If Murphy, Dolan, and Riley built the house and Fritz financed it, Walls ensured it survived. He managed the flow of credit, legitimized corruption through banking ties, and gave the empire its most powerful disguise: respectability. When the war came, men like Billy the Kid fought it with bullets. Men like Edgar Walls fought it with signatures. Let's turn the page to the next man who turned numbers into weapons: Edgar Walls, the banker who kept the books on blood. The charge? Keeping a dying empire solvent and ensuring that even as men bled in the streets, the accounts still balanced. By the late 1870s, the House was cracking. Lawrence Murphy was dead. James Dolan was drowning in debt and scandal. Riley had vanished into quieter pursuits. And yet, somehow, the machine kept turning. That was thanks in no small part to Edgar Walls. He wasn't born into the Lincoln County conflict, but he arrived when it needed him the most. A banker sent to keep the crumbling empire afloat. Walls was tied by both blood and business to one of the most powerful men in the Southwest, Thomas Benton Catrone, attorney, land baron, and master manipulator behind the Santa Fe Ring, the political machine that ruled New Mexico like a private kingdom. Catrone held the mortgage on Dolan's assets, and when the house began to collapse under the weight of corruption, Catrone sent in his man to take control, Edgar Walls. Walls arrived in Lincoln not as a fighter, but as a steward. His job was simple: protect Catrone's investment, manage the store, and ensure the Dolan faction's money and influence didn't vanish with their credibility. But nothing in Lincoln County was ever simple. The feud had already turned to blood, and by the time Walls walked through the doors of the Murphy Dolan store, Lincoln was a war zone. Rival factions, Dolan's men on one side, McSween's and Tunstall's on the other, were poised for the showdown that would define the county for generations. During the 5-day battle in July of 1878, Walls was reportedly present in Lincoln as the last great confrontation unfolded. Fires raging, bullets tearing through walls, and the town itself burning under the weight of its own greed. He wasn't there to shoot or to die. He was there to make sure that when the smoke cleared, the money still had an owner. That was the quiet truth of men like Edgar Walls. They never had to pull a trigger to control the outcome. While gunmen fought for ground, men like Walls decided who owned the land beneath it. After the war, Walls remained in business, proof that those who deal in paper often outlive those who deal in lead. He lived until 1935, dying peacefully in San Diego, California, far from the ruins of Lincoln. The verdict of time? Edgar Walls was not a villain by reputation, but he was an accountant to villains. He represented a new breed of frontier power, educated, connected, and untouchable. When the old guard of the house fell to disease, debt, and violence, Walls ensured their legacy and their creditors stayed alive. He was the living bridge between the frontier's blood feuds and the quiet takeover of New Mexico by the Santa Fe Ring, where lawyers, bankers, and politicians replaced gunfighters as the architects of power. In the courtroom of history, Edgar Walls stands as the bookkeeper of the fallen, the man who made sure that even after the war was over, the balance sheet of the house still came out in the black. By the late 1870s, the house had money, land, and political power, but what it didn't have anymore was control. Their ledgers could bully the honest, and their contracts could bankrupt the weak, but paper doesn't stop a bullet. To enforce their rule, the house needed muscle, not merchants, not bankers, gunmen. And that's when they turned to Jesse Evans and the boys. Evans was everything Murphy, Dolan, and Walls weren't. Young, fearless, and mean enough to do their dirty work without hesitation. His gang moved through Lincoln County like wildfire, stealing cattle, intimidating witnesses, torching businesses, and killing anyone who stood between the house and its control of the valley. They called themselves cowboys. The law called them outlaws. But in Lincoln County, they were employees. Hired protection, paid intimidation, the trigger hand of the house. When lawyers couldn't silence the opposition and bankers couldn't buy obedience, Jesse Evans and his men made sure the message was delivered another way: loud, bloody, and permanent. They didn't just enforce debts, they collected them in blood. Now the courtroom of history calls its next witness Jesse Evans and the boys who rode beside him, the enforcers who turned the house's greed into war. The charge? Murder, rustling, and serving as the gun hand of Lincoln County's most corrupt empire. If the house was a fortress built on greed, Jesse Evans was the man who guarded its gates with bullets instead of laws. Born in 1853, possibly in Missouri or Texas, Evans wasn't raised for gentleness or obedience. He came of age in the chaos of the frontier, a place where survival and sin walked hand in hand. He started his life on the edge of respectability. working for cattle ranchers like John Chisholm, but it didn't take long for him to learn that there was faster money to be made on the other side of the brand. By his early 20s, Evans had formed his own crew, a vicious and loyal band of thieves and gunfighters known across New Mexico and West Texas as the Jesse Evans Gang, or simply the Boys. Evans' gang was made up of some of the hardest men in the territory: Frank Baker, Tom Hill, Pony Deal, and from time to time, even Billy the Kid rode among them. Before choosing a different path and becoming their bitter enemy, they wrestled cattle, robbed stagecoaches, raided ranches, and enforced their will with cold precision. When violence became currency in Lincoln County, Jesse Evans was the one everyone knew could collect. And that reputation drew attention, powerful attention. When the Lincoln County War erupted, the Murphy-Dolan faction, desperate for muscle, turned to Evans and his crew. They didn't need a sheriff, they needed killers. Evans delivered. In February 1878, Jesse Evans and the Boys ambushed and murdered John Tunstall, the act that lit the match for the Lincoln County War. From that moment, Evans wasn't just a criminal, he was a soldier for hire, fighting on behalf of the house. His gang carried out raids, assassinations, and ambushes across the county, attacking the Regulators, burning property, and hunting McSween supporters like prey. Even hardened men feared him. Billy the Kid himself once admitted that he'd rather negotiate than cross Jesse Evans head on. He was there when Frank McNabb was cut down, when the Battle of Lincoln turned the town into a war zone, and when blood became the language of business. When the war ended, Evans didn't fade away. He simply returned to what he knew best: killing for profit. In 1879, he and his men murdered attorney Houston Chapman, a crime so brazen it reignited the outrage that had barely cooled since the war's end. But the law was finally catching up. After a gunfight in Presidio, Texas, where Evans killed a Texas Ranger, he was captured, tried, and sentenced to Huntsville State Prison. It should have been the end of him, but like any outlaw worth a legend, Jesse Evans refused to stay caged. In 1882, during a prison work detail, he vanished, escaping into the wind, never to be seen again. Some say he died in Mexico. Others swore they saw him years later, gray and smiling in a border town saloon. No one ever proved a thing. The verdict of time? Jesse Evans was the perfect outlaw for the perfect storm. Charming, violent, and unflinchingly loyal to whoever paid him the most. He wasn't a politician, a merchant, or a soldier. He was a weapon. When the house needed enforcers, he became its trigger hand, the living embodiment of the greed and brutality that ruled Lincoln County. His gang didn't fight for justice or for survival. They fought for money, power, and the thrill of being feared. And when the war ended, Evans left behind nothing but ghosts and a legend that refused to die. In the history of the American frontier, Jesse Evans stands as proof that the West wasn't tamed by law. It was bought, fought, and burned into submission by men like him. By the time Jesse Evans and the Boys had soaked Lincoln County in blood, the House had learned one truth: loyalty could be bought, but it never came cheap. When they needed even more men to fight their war, they didn't look to soldiers or deputies. They looked to drifters, ranch hands, and outlaws who lived by one rule: whoever paid the best owned their trigger finger. That was the Seven Rivers Warriors. They came out of Seven Rivers, New Mexico, a settlement halfway between nowhere and the Badlands, a place where the law barely bothered to ride. These men weren't bound by cause or conscience. They weren't fighting for the House or for the Regulators. They fought for whoever put the most whiskey on the table and the most cash in their hand. They were a loose brotherhood of ranchers, rustlers, and opportunists, a temporary army of outlaws that would soon help decide the fate of Lincoln County. And when the war broke open, they become the hired guns that gave the House its numbers. With Evans and the Boys leading the charge, the Seven Rivers Warriors rode in behind them, burning homes, ambushing rivals, and helping drive McSween's men into retreat. They turned the fight into something bigger than business, a campaign of chaos that swallowed every ranch and river crossing for miles. They weren't loyalists. They were survivors. And when the dust settled, they rode off just as easily as they'd ridden in, pockets heavy and consciences empty. Next on the docket, the men who turned mercenary and whose bullets carried no allegiance but greed. The Seven Rivers Warriors, hired guns who fought for pay, not for principle. The charge? Fighting for both sides of the law, and proving that in Lincoln County, justice and outlawry often rode the same horse. In the Badlands of southeastern Lincoln County, near a stretch of water called Seven Rivers, a different kind of army took shape. They weren't hired gunmen, not at first. They were small ranchers, the kind who scraped by on hard land and harder luck. Men caught between the endless herds of John Chisholm's cattle empire and the unforgiving emptiness of the New Mexico frontier. When Chisholm's livestock swallowed the grazing range and his influence smothered smaller operations, resentment turned to rebellion. That rebellion became a gang. They called themselves the Seven Rivers Warriors. Led by Henry M. Hugh Beckwith and his brothers Bob and John, the Warriors were a volatile mix of ranchers, rustlers, and roughnecks who decided that if the system was rigged, they'd play by their own rules. They stole cattle, raided corrals, and ran their own shadow economy across the dry basins of Lincoln County, not just for profit, but for survival. But when the Lincoln County War broke out in 1876, survival found new meaning. The Beckwiths, along with their men, threw in with the Murphy-Dolan faction, not because they admired the house, but because they despised its enemy, John Chisholm, whose alliance with John Tunstall and Alexander McSween made him the natural target of their anger. And so, the Seven Rivers Warriors became the house's newest hired guns, fighting a war that they didn't start for men that they didn't like against ranchers that they'd once worked beside. They worked closely with Jesse Evans and John Kinney's gangs, riding as reinforcements and enforcers. They attacked Tunstall's men, raided McSween's properties, and turned Lincoln County into a battleground of burnt fences, stolen herds, and murdered rivals. But what made them truly dangerous wasn't just their guns, it was their badges. Several members, including Bob Beckwith, Wallace Ollinger, Bob Ollinger, held official law enforcement positions. Beckwith and Wallace Ollinger were deputies under Sheriff William Brady, while Bob Ollinger was a sworn U.S. Marshal. That meant the same men who burned out farms by night could arrest their victims by day. The line between law and outlaw didn't just blur, it completely disappeared. Their notoriety peaked with the killing of Regulator Frank McNabb, the capture of Frank Coe, and their bloody participation in the Battle of Lincoln in 1878, where Bob Beckwith was shot dead amid the chaos. But victory was short-lived. After the war, their unity dissolved faster than the smoke that rose from Lincoln's ruins. Greed, guilt, and vengeance tore them apart. Former allies turned on each other, and the once feared Seven Rivers Warriors destroyed themselves from within. By the end, the gang was gone, scattered across the Southwest, their badges stripped, their names reduced to footnotes in a feud that had outlasted them. The verdict of time? The Seven Rivers Warriors were the frontier's truest reflection, men trying to survive in a world run by power and profit. They began as ranchers fighting monopolies and ended as killers for hire, trapped in a war where loyalty was a luxury no one could afford. Their story is proof that in Lincoln County, justice wore two faces, one carved in brass and pinned to a vest, and the other hidden behind a loaded gun. The Seven Rivers Warriors, outlaws, deputies, and everything in between. By the time the Seven Rivers Warriors had turned the frontier into no man's land, the House still wasn't finished recruiting. They had politicians to buy and bankers to balance the books, but what they needed most were soldiers. And when the law couldn't provide enough muscle, they turned south to a crew already notorious from Mesilla to El Paso, men who didn't fight for loyalty, land, or justice. They fought for pay. They were the John Kinney Gang. Kinney's outfit was one of the meanest and most organized outlaw groups in New Mexico territory, a mix of deserters, drifters, and career criminals who made their living the only way that they knew how, by taking what others couldn't protect. They rustled cattle, robbed freighters, and sold their services to whoever could afford them. And during the Lincoln County War, that employer was the House. While Jesse Evans and the Seven Rivers Warrior handled the local brawls, John Kinney's men brought precision, trained fighters who knew how to ambush, intimidate, and vanish before dawn. Their ranks included gunmen who would later become infamous in their own right, men like Pony Deal, Jess Evans, and Dirty Steve Stevens, names whispered in saloons from Roswell to Tucson. They fought not for a cause, but for a contract, raiding McSween's allies, escorting Murphy Dolan shipments, and adding their firepower to the House's campaign of fear. Wherever the Kinney Gang rode, the message was clear. Resistance meant ruin. But even mercenaries have limits, and when the smoke began to clear, Kinney's men scattered. Some hanged, some vanished, and some, like their leader, turned their notoriety into uneasy truces with the very law that they once defied. Next on the stand, John Kinney and his gang, the mercenaries of Mesilla, men who fought for gold, not glory, and left Lincoln County bloodier than they found it. John Kinney's in Young Guns. You remember him? Charlie was terrified.
Sure, I'm still over here.
Yes, I am. Charlie was terrified of John Kinney. It's John Kinney. It's John Kinney. It's John. Thank you very much, Charlie. Before the Lincoln County War, before the House began buying loyalties by the bullet, every kind of outfit already ruled the borderlands. Hard men who lived by no law but survival and no allegiance but profit. They called themselves the John Kinney Gang. Though in the border towns and Badlands, most folks knew them by another name, the Rio Grande Posse. Led by John Kinney, a former Army sergeant who traded his uniform for an outlaw's coat, the gang carved its reputation out of the southern New Mexico territory. Based in Dona Ana County, they operated like a roaming militia, equal parts cattle thieves, bandits, and hired killers. Their early years were soaked in violence. They rustled cattle on both sides of the border, robbed ranchers and stage lines, and weren't afraid to square off with soldiers or sheriffs alike. In 1875, they crossed a line even by outlaw standards, a deadly gunfight with U.S. cavalry troops in Las Cruces that left soldiers and civilians dead. From that moment on, the Kinney Gang's name carried the weight of infamy from Mesilla to El Paso. The gang's ranks shifted constantly. Men came and went, but the names that remained became legend. Jesse Evans, Pony Deal, Jim McDaniels, all rode under Kinney's banner at one time or another. They were young, mean, and efficient, the kind of men who could turn a cattle trail into a graveyard before breakfast. When the Lincoln County War erupted, the House needed muscle to back their monopoly. Kinney had men, trained, armed, and ruthless, and he didn't ask many questions. Sheriff George Pepin deputized him and his gang, turning outlaws into lawmen overnight. Their badges may have been official, but their actions were not. Under Murphy and Dolan's payroll, the Kinney Gang fought the Regulators, burned property, raided safe houses, and joined the Battle of Lincoln, a siege that left the town smoldering and the power balance forever changed. They were the muscle that gave the House teeth, and when it came to killing, they didn't distinguish between legality and vengeance. But wars end and hired guns always move on. After the smoke cleared, the Kinney gang drifted south again, some joining other outlaw outfits like Selman Scouts, others dying in anonymous shootouts that barely made the papers. As for John Kinney, the man who started it all, his story didn't end in a blaze of gunfire. The law finally caught up to him in 1883 when he was convicted of cattle rustling. He served a short term behind bars before walking free, and in a strange twist of fate, he later rejoined the U.S. Army during the Spanish-American War. From deserter to outlaw, from outlaw to soldier, John Kinney was the frontier's most adaptable survivor. His gang may have been born in blood, but he died in peace, leaving behind a legend that blurred the line between bandit and mercenary. The verdict of time? The John Kinney gang was the hired gun of the borderlands, a band of soldiers without a country, outlaws with discipline, and killers for rent. They didn't ride for honor or vengeance. They rode for pay and for the thrill of watching men with power realize that money couldn't buy safety forever. Their legacy is written in both ink and blood, a testament to how lawlessness wasn't the opposite of order in the Old West. It was often its twin. The Rio Grande Posse, where the Army's discipline met the outlaws' creed and where the frontier learned that justice was always for sale. By the time the House had filled its ranks with mercenaries and outlaws, Lincoln County was less a town and more a battlefield. Every man had chosen a side or had one chosen for him. But for one gunman, his choice would ignite the bloodiest chapter of them all. His name was William Buck Morton, though most knew him simply as Billy Morton. Morton was no hired thug fresh off the trail. He was a seasoned ranch hand, a marksman, and a man whose loyalty to the house was as deadly as his aim. He had ridden with Jesse Evans, fought beside the Seven Rivers Warriors, and knew how to make violence look like business. When the conflict between Murphy Dolan and Tunstall McSween turned from words to bullets, Buck Morton became the point of the spear. He wasn't paid to threaten, he was paid to finish. And it was Morton who rode that February day in 1878 alongside Jesse Evans and Tom Hill when the ambush came, the one that left John Henry Tunstall face down in the dust, his life ended by the men he'd refused to bow to. That killing, that single act of murder on the open range, became the spark that set Lincoln County ablaze. The Regulators would rise from it. Billy the Kid would be forged by it, and every man who rode with Buck Morton that day would soon find himself marked for death. Now the court of history calls forward the next witness, William Buck Morton, the gunman whose bullets began the war that would define the West. The charge? Murder, ambush, and the single gunshot that lit the fuse of the Lincoln County War. By 1878, William Buck Morton, or Billy Morton, depending on who was telling the story, had already made a name for himself on the wrong side of the law. He wasn't just an outlaw. He was a man of divided loyalties, a rustler wearing a deputy's badge, riding for a sheriff who took orders from the House. Morton had started as a cowboy and a cattle hand, but ambition and violence carried him further. When Sheriff William Brady deputized him, it gave Morton's crimes a thin layer of legitimacy, the kind that made murder look like law enforcement. He rode with Jesse Evans, served the interests of Murphy and Dolan, and when the time came to silence their most dangerous rival, John Henry Tunstall, Morton didn't hesitate. On February the 18th, 1878, along a lonely stretch near Blackwater Creek, Tunstall's horse bolted under fire. Morton and his fellow riders closed in. The Englishman's body was found moments later, shot in the head, execution style, and left in the dust. That killing didn't just take a man's life, it started a war. Within days, the Regulators were born, a posse sworn to bring justice to the men who killed Tunstall. Their first order of business? Find Buck Morton. They chased him for days through the desert, cornered him near Blackwater Canyon, and captured him alongside fellow gang member Frank Baker. For several tense days, Morton was marched under guard. Dick Brewer, Charlie Bowdry, and the young Billy the Kid among his captors. The Regulators claimed that Morton and Baker tried to escape. History remembers it differently. 2 gunshots echoed through the canyon. Both men were dead before the dust settled. The death of Buck Morton didn't bring peace, it brought blood. The Regulators had taken revenge, and the Murphy Dolan faction vowed to return it tenfold. Each killing justified the next until Lincoln County became a graveyard of grudges and ghosts. The verdict of time? William Buck Morton stands as a symbol of the West's greatest contradiction, a man sworn to uphold the law who instead became its executioner. His bullet killed John Tunstall, and his death in turn fueled the vengeance that defined the Lincoln County War. He wasn't the first to die in that feud, but he was the first who had to. The deputy, the outlaw, the spark, Buck Morton, the man whose shot still echoes through Lincoln's dust. When Buck Morton fell into the Regulators' hands, he wasn't alone. Riding beside him that day, a rifle across his saddle and a bounty on his head, was another gunman whose name never carried the same weight, but whose fate was sealed by the same war. His name? Frank Baker. Baker was a rustler, gun hand, and a member of the Jesse Evans gang, one of the many men who had traded their brand for a bullet when the House began paying for protection. He wasn't a leader, he wasn't even notorious, but in Lincoln County, that didn't matter. You only had to ride with the wrong men to die for the wrong cause. When John Tunstall was gunned down on that cold February morning in 1878, Baker rode in the same company as Morton and the killers who fired the fatal shots. That single act, an ambush turned execution, made him a marked man. The Regulators swore an oath of vengeance, and within weeks, Baker and Morton were running for their lives. The posse that hunted them, led by Dick Brewer with Billy the Kid, Charlie Bowdry, and Doc Scurlock among its ranks, caught up near Blackwater Canyon after a long and desperate chase. For 4 days, the prisoners were marched under armed guard, weary, silent, and resigned to their fate. When the march ended, so did their lives. The Regulators claimed Baker and Morton tried to escape, but the truth, whispered even then, was simpler. The Regulators executed them, justice by the gun, frontier style. Frank Baker's name faded into the background of the blood-soaked feud, overshadowed by legends like Billy the Kid, Buck Morton, and John Tunstall. But for those who study the war, his death marks a turning point, the moment when vengeance stopped pretending to be law. Next to take the stand, Frank Baker, the forgotten gunman who paid the price for a crime that changed the West. The charge? Murder, ambush, and dying by the same justice he once claimed to serve. In Lincoln County, loyalty was a currency, and Frank Baker spent his on the wrong side of history. He was a man who wore 2 faces, deputy by day, outlaw by night, a gun for hire, a peace officer when it paid, and a loyal enforcer for the House. Baker rode with Jesse Evans and the men who brought order through intimidation. Deputized by Sheriff William Brady, he helped turn badges into weapons, symbols not of law but of ownership. By the winter of 1878, his allegiance was clear. He stood with Murphy and Dolan, the merchants who ruled Lincoln County like kings. When John Tunstall refused to kneel to them, Baker saddled up with Buck Morton and the posse that hunted him down. On February 18, 1878, Tunstall was cornered and killed, shot in cold blood as his horse bolted in terror. The single gunshot tore through more than just flesh and bone. It ripped open the heart of Lincoln County and set in motion one of the bloodiest feuds the West would ever know. The Regulators, sworn in to avenge their employer's murder, put Baker's name at the top of their list. They found him 3 weeks later, riding with Morton near the Pecos River. Captured after a hard chase, Baker was shackled, marched across miles of desert, and held under guard by Dick Brewer, Billy the Kid, and Charlie Bowdry. The Regulators said he tried to escape. The truth? They executed him. Frontier justice, quick and final. 2 shots at Blackwater Creek, and the bodies of Baker and Morton left where they fell. Their deaths didn't close the chapter. They tore it wider open. Each killing begot another. Each act of vengeance demanded its reply. And the war that began with John Tunstall's blood would not end until Lincoln itself lay smoldering in ruin. The verdict of time? Frank Baker was both deputy and outlaw, lawman and killer, a man caught between ambition and survival. He rode for a cause built on greed and died in the name of justice turned vengeance. In the end, his story is the story of Lincoln County itself, a place where every man claimed the law was on his side, and none of them were right. The deputy who rode for power and died for it, Frank Baker, another casualty in the war the West could never forget. By the time Frank Baker and Buck Morton met their end in the dust of Blackwater Creek, the war for Lincoln County was no longer about cattle or contracts. It had become personal, bloody, unforgiving, and in that growing chaos rode one of the wildest, most unpredictable men the frontier ever produced, Tom Hill. Hill wasn't a businessman or a rancher. He wasn't even a soldier of fortune like the rest. He was a wanderer with a gun, an outlaw who drifted between gangs, trading loyalty for liquor and bullets for coin. He'd ridden with Jesse Evans, fought beside Buck Morton, and earned a reputation for speed, temper, and recklessness that even the hardest men in Lincoln County didn't want to test. But what made Hill truly dangerous wasn't his aim, it was his impulse. He didn't plan ambushes, he started them. When John Tunstall was murdered in February of '78, witnesses said Hill was there, one of the gunmen who helped corner the English rancher and fired the fatal shots. Some accounts claim it was Hill's bullet that struck first. Others say he was just another trigger in the smoke. Either way, his name was etched into history the moment Tunstall hit the ground. The Regulators wanted him next, but Hill didn't wait to be hunted. He struck first. Not long after Tunstall's death in a skirmish near the Pecos, he drew his gun and went down in the exchange, shot dead before the war even hit its stride. His death didn't make the headlines. It didn't change the course of the war, but it added another ghost to a long list of names that Lincoln County would never bury properly. Tom Hill, outlaw, gunman, and the wild card in a feud that no one controlled. He didn't live long enough to see what his violence helped unleash, but the war that he helped start, it was only just beginning. The charge, murder, ambush, and setting the spark that ignited Lincoln County's deadliest war. Before the smoke of the Lincoln County War ever darkened the horizon, there was Tom Hill, a gunman with a short temper, a quicker trigger, and no fear of dying on the wrong side of history. Hill wasn't a strategist or a hired deputy. He was the kind of man who solved problems at gunpoint and let someone else count the cost later. A restless drifter with a reputation for violence, he found his place among the Jesse Evans gang, a crew already thick with rustlers, killers, and mercenaries for the house. Together, they became the Murphy-Dolan faction's iron fist, the men who made sure no rival business, no defiant rancher, and no outsider challenged their rule in Lincoln County. On February 18, 1978, that defiance had a name, John Tunstall. Hill rode with Jesse Evans, Buck Morton, and Frank Baker as they tracked Tunstall through the scrubland north of Lincoln. When the rancher's horse spooked and bolted, the posse gave chase. Moments later, shots rang out. Eyewitnesses would later argue who fired first, but most agreed on one thing. Tom Hill pulled the trigger that ended John Tunstall's life. It was the gunshot heard around Lincoln County, the one that transformed a business feud into a full-scale frontier war. Hill kept riding with the Evans gang after the murder, raiding ranches and terrorizing Tunstall's allies under the banner of Murphy and Dolan. But in a land where revenge rode faster than justice, his time was short. Just 3 weeks later, on March the 9th, 1878, during a botched cattle raid near Tularosa, Hill's violent streak met its match. Local ranchers opened fire, and when the smoke cleared, Tom Hill was dead. Jesse Evans wounded beside him, his gang scattered into the desert wind. Hill's death came swiftly, but the fire he started would rage for years. By the time his body cooled, Lincoln County was already drowning in blood. Revenge killings, ambushes, and burning homesteads marking the landscape that he helped destroy. The verdict of time? Tom Hill was the kind of man the frontier created and destroyed in equal measure. Too reckless for peace, too fearless for mercy. He didn't plan the Lincoln County War, but his bullets started it. And though he died before the conflict reached its darkest hours, his shadow lingered over every killing that followed. Tom Hill, the outlaw who struck the match and burned with it. There's not near as much Young Guns to reference when you're talking about a house because they didn't really
They're really in it.
No, I mean, I don't know if Tom Hill, if like Henry Hill, who Billy the Kid shot first in Young Guns in the outhouse, and he says, Henry Hill?
Well,
Heidi. And then he jumps out into a pool of pee. I don't know.
Oh, yeah, that's not a good thing.
I don't know if that was like Tom Hill. I don't know for sure.
Huh.
There's not near as many of the house's side really represented in any real detail. I mean, some of the names are thrown out there like Sheriff Pepin and John Kinney and stuff, but they didn't really build out those characters so much. So, but the next one was definitely in Young Guns.
Okay.
So by the time Tom Hill fell in a Tularosa gunfight, the war he helped start was burning through Lincoln County like brush fire. Every gun that fired seemed to birth another feud, another vendetta, another death. But not every man who found himself in the crosshairs had gone looking for it. Some were just unlucky enough to live in the wrong county at the wrong time. That was Andrew L. Buckshot Roberts. Roberts wasn't an outlaw or a lawman. He was a tired frontiersman trying to sell his land and leave New Mexico behind before the war swallowed it whole. He'd once done business with the House, and that was enough to make him a marked man. In Lincoln County, guilt didn't need proof. It only needed rumor. So, when the Regulators rode out looking for anyone tied to Tunstall's killers, they found Roberts at his cabin near Blazer's Mill. 12 men against one. They called for his surrender. He answered with his rifle. What followed would become one of the most famous standoffs of the entire Lincoln County War. A lone gunman who wanted no part of the fight, forced to defend himself against the very war that refused to let him leave it. Next to take the stand, Buckshot Roberts, the man who didn't start the fight, but sure as hell finished one. The charge? Defiance, survival, and refusing to surrender when the war came to his door. Andrew Buckshot Roberts was a legendary figure of the frontier, part soldier, part survivor, and one of the most unexpected combatants in the Lincoln County War. Born in 1831, Roberts was a Texas Ranger and a Civil War veteran, a man hardened by years of conflict and marked by it. The buckshot buried in his soldier from an old wound gave him his nickname and a lifetime reminder that he was never easy to kill. By the late 1870s, Roberts owned a modest ranch in the Ruidoso Valley near Lincoln. Though he had done some business with the Murphy Dolan faction, he had no loyalty to any side. He was a frontiersman, ready to sell out, pack up, and move on before the violence consumed everything around him. But in Lincoln County, neutrality didn't exist. Once the Regulators marked your name, there was no way out. On April 4th, 1878, Roberts rode into Blazer's Mill to collect a payment, unaware that a large group of Regulators, including Billy the Kid, Charlie Bowdry, and Dick Brewer, were waiting. They demanded his surrender, believing him aligned with the House. Roberts refused, taking cover behind a carpenter's shop as the standoff erupted into one of the fierce gunfights of the Lincoln County War. Outnumbered 12-1, Roberts fought like a man determined to die on his own terms. He wounded several regulators, including Charlie Bowdry and John Middleton, and with a single deadly shot, he killed regulator leader Dick Brewer. Despite being hit multiple times himself, Roberts held his ground until his body finally gave out. He died later that evening from his wounds, but not before earning the respect of every man who faced him. So as you can see, a little bit different than in the movie.
Yeah,
when he come in to collect the bounty for all of their heads, it didn't quite play out that way.
Yeah.
But Brian Keith played that role freaking flawlessly, like I say. The guy was such a badass actor. He was really freaking good. So the verdict of time for Buckshot Roberts, well, he didn't fight for a faction or a fortune or a name. He fought because he had no choice. In a war built on greed, betrayal, and vengeance, he became the rarest thing Lincoln County ever saw. A man who stood alone for nothing but his own survival. He didn't start the fight, but when it came for him, he damn sure finished it. By the time Buckshot Roberts fell at Blazer's Mill, the war had already claimed too many men who never meant to fight it. But Lincoln County wasn't running out of willing guns. The battle lines were drawn deeper now. The House on one side, the Regulators on the other. And every man wearing a badge had to choose which master he was going to serve. For Robert Bob Beckwith, that choice had already been made. A small rancher turned deputy sheriff, Beckwith was part of the Seven Rivers Warriors, the band of rough men who walked the thin line between lawman and outlaw. He rode for Sheriff William Brady, stood with Murphy and Dolan, and fought to keep their power intact while Lincoln County burned around him. When the call came to defend the house during the Battle of Lincoln, Beckwith didn't hesitate. It was July of 1878, and the town had become a battlefield. Smoke, dust, and gunfire choking the air as the Regulators made their stand. Amid the chaos, Beckwith took his position, badge glinting faintly through the haze. Moments later, a bullet tore through him. He fell dead in the street. Another lawman turned casualty in a war that no law could control. Next to take the stand, Robert W. Bob Beckwith, the deputy who rode for the house and met his end defending it.
I struggle with the name Bob for back in the day.
Yeah?
I don't know why.
Really?
Yeah. Just Bob doesn't seem like a back in the day name.
There's more than one in this story. We've also got Bob Ollinger that we'll be talking about too.
It doesn't sound right. Bob seems too now.
Bob's a pretty old name.
I know, but it just doesn't feel right.
The charge: lawman, outlaw, and enforcer for the house. Robert W. Bob Beckwith
I can't.
was one of the most feared and loyal members of the Seven Rivers Warriors, the gang of ranchers turned gunmen who fought on behalf of the Murphy-Dolan faction during the Lincoln County War. Born in 1850 in New Mexico to Hugh Beckwith and Refugia Rescon y Pino.
Good job.
I think so. I don't know. Bob was raised in the volatile ranchlands of southeastern Lincoln County, a place where rustling and gunfighting were as common as branding irons. When war came to Lincoln County, Beckwith stood firmly with the house. He wasn't just another gun in the saddle. He wore a badge, serving as deputy sheriff under Sheriff William Brady. Beckwith enjoyed the legal protection that allowed him and the Seven Rivers Warriors to carry out raids, cattle thefts, and violent reprisals with near impunity. To the public, he was law enforcement. To the Regulators, he was an outlaw with paperwork. In April 1878, Beckwith rode with the posse that ambushed Frank McNabb, Ab Sanders, and Frank Coe, killing McNabb and capturing Coe in one of the bloodiest skirmishes of the war. It was a calculated move, one that sent a clear message to anyone daring to oppose the Murphy-Dolan Empire. But the violence Beckwith helped unleash would circle back on him before the summer's end. By July 1878, the war reached its peak at the Battle of Lincoln. The town was a war zone. bullets whistling through the adobe walls, smoke curling from the burning rooftops, and every alley hiding death. Beckwith fought alongside other House loyalists as they laid siege to the McSween home, where the Regulators made their last stand. When the Regulators tried to break on July 19th, Beckwith was caught in the storm. Accounts differ, but most say that it was Billy the Kid's bullet that found him, cutting him down in the dust and the chaos of the final escape. His death ended one of the most brutal chapters for the Seven Rivers Warriors and marked another toll in the endless cycle of revenge that defined the Lincoln County War. The verdict of time? Bob Beckwith was the embodiment of Lincoln County's corruption, a lawman who enforced monopoly through gunfire and fear. He fought not for justice, but for power. And yet, when the smoke cleared, he met the same fate as the outlaws that he hunted. He rode for the house, killed for it, and finally died defending it. Proof that in Lincoln County, even the law had blood on its hands.
Damn Bob.
Oh, here's another one for you. So, by the time Bob Beckwith fell in the streets of Lincoln, the war had become more than cattle and contracts. It was a vendetta machine, feeding on blood, rumor, and pride. Every man on both sides had his list, and every list was getting shorter by the day. But before the flames consumed Lincoln County, before the ambushes and the house burnings, there was one moment, one spark that set the whole thing roaring to life. And that spark came from a man named Charlie Lolly Cooler Crawford.
I can get on board with that one.
Yeah, you like
I like that one.
Lolly Cooler?
Yeah, I'm good.
Crawford was a hard drinker, a quick temper with a six-shooter, and a loyal ally to Lawrence Murphy and James Dolan. He wasn't a strategist or a leader. He was the kind of man the House used when they wanted a problem handled without paperwork. By early 1878, the air in Lincoln was thick with tension. Too many threats, too many guns, and too much whiskey. And then came the gunfire. In a drunken confrontation, Crawford opened fire on Alexander McSween's attorney, Houston Chapman, outside the saloon, an act of sudden violence that tore away the last thin layer of civility in Lincoln County. The killing inflamed tempers, shattered any hope of restraint, and set off a blood feud that became the Lincoln County War. Now the courtroom of history calls its next witness, Charlie Lolly Cooler Crawford, the hothead gunman whose bullets turned a rivalry into a war. And is Charlie Crawford in Young Guns?
Is a bad guy?
Mm-hmm.
I don't remember.
Just barely.
That's
when they're stuck in the McSween house and Billy hollers out, he says, "Hey, Sheriff Pepin, looks like you got Charlie Crawford down there with you."
Ah.
And he says, "Oh, yeah, we got a lot of them." Boom. "Hey, Pepin, Charlie Crawford's not with you anymore." So the charge, sharpshooting, siege, and turning the high ground into a killing field. Charlie Lolly Cooler Crawford.
Where did that name come from, though? Do we know?
I don't think...
Sorry. It's not even important, but I need to know the unimportant things.
Yeah, I don't think I know where that name came from, honestly.
How dare you?
I know, I'm sorry.
You know this about me by now. I'm going to ask you the weirdest questions.
This is true.
That mean nothing.
So, Charlie Lolly Cooler Crawford was a marksman, a gun for hire, and one of the most deadly members of the Seven Rivers Warriors.
To see if I can find it.
The outlaw band aligned with the Murphy-Dolan faction during the Lincoln County War. Known for his precision with a rifle, Crawford wasn't the type to charge into town with six-shooters blazing. He preferred to fight from a distance where one good shot could settle a score. By July of 78, the war had reached its bloody crescendo at the Battle of Lincoln, a 5-day siege that turned the dusty settlement into a battlefield. Crawford took his position high above the town, joined by Lucilo Montoya, and another Mexican picket. From that ridge, the trio rained death down upon the besieged regulators trapped inside the McSween's adobe house. Armed with a long-range buffalo rifle, Crawford became one of the house's most valuable assets during the standoff. Each shot from the ridge struck the walls like thunder, forcing the defenders to stay low and return fire blindly through the smoke and the shattered plaster. For days, he helped pin the regulators inside while Lincoln burned around them. But on July 18th, 1878, the man who had hunted from the hills became the hunted. From somewhere within town, Regulator Fernando Herrera raised his rifle and took aim, a shot estimated between 756 and 900 yards, one of the longest on record in frontier history. The bullet struck true, shattering Crawford's back and dropping him where he stood. He lay under the sun for hours before his allies managed to reach him. By the time they brought him down into town, it was too late. There was no doctor, no comfort, and no miracle waiting. Charlie Lolly Cooler Crawford died from his wounds, one of the final casualties of the siege he helped sustain.
It was meant sarcastically as an insult to his luck and intelligence.
Interesting. But does it say what Lolly Cooler is supposed to mean?
As a derogatory moniker given to Charlie Crawford by his enemies, the Tunstall men.
Huh.
That's all it says.
Very
it was meant
interesting.
to be
an insult.
An insult to his luck and intelligence.
Well, there you have it.
There you have it.
And that, by the way, is a freaking incredible shot. 800 to 900 yards with probably like a Winchester 73. I mean, that's unbelievable. I mean, for now, with like a 30-06 or something, it's nothing. But back then, that's an incredible shot. Anyhow.
Meanwhile, back at the ranch.
The verdict of time. Charlie Lolly Cooler Crawford was the embodiment of the frontier gunman, cold-eyed, calculating, and lethal from a mile away. His skill as a sharpshooter made him a weapon of the house, but it was another man's bullet, fired from equally steady hands, that brought him down. He lived by distance, precision, and control, but in Lincoln County, even the best shot couldn't escape the reach of fate. By the time Charlie Lolly Cooler Crawford fell from the ridge, the Battle of Lincoln was in its final hours. The regulators were pinned, the house was burning, and the sound of the rifle fire rolled through the valley like thunder refusing to fade. But for every gunman who went down, there always seemed to be another ready to take his place. One of those men was Charles Dutch Charlie Cruling, a survivor, a hired gun, and one of the last of the house's hard cases still standing when the smoke cleared. Cruling wasn't a famous outlaw or a local rancher. He was a professional, a drifter with a mean streak and a steady trigger finger. The kind of man you paid to do a job and didn't ask twice about the details. He'd ridden with the Seven Rivers Warrior, stood guard for Dolan's men, and fought through the bloodiest stretches of the Lincoln County War, from open skirmishes on the plains to the last desperate shootouts in the streets of Lincoln itself. When the war was over and the bodies buried, Cruling was one of the few left alive to tell about it. But, like most of the house's gunmen, survival didn't mean peace. It just meant living long enough to carry the weight of what he'd done. Next to take the stand, Charles Dutch Charlie Cruling, the gun for hire who outlasted the war but never outran its ghost.
I like his name.
Dutch Charlie?
Mm-hmm.
You like it better than Lolly Cooler?
I do.
The charge? Enforcer, gunman, and loyal soldier for the house. Charles Dutch Charlie Cruling was one of the many shadowy figures who fought and bled for the Murphy-Dolan faction during the Lincoln County War. As a member of the Seven Rivers Warriors, Cruling wasn't a leader or a lawman. He was a fighter, a hired hand for a war that devoured every man who thought he could control it. He rode wherever the house needed muscle, working as both enforcer and gunman, his rifle serving the interests of Murphy, Dolan, and their powerful allies. Like most of the Seven Rivers men, Cruling lived in the gray space between law and outlaw, wearing a badge when it offered protection and discarding it when the job called for blood instead of paperwork. Cruling's most infamous moment came in the spring of 1878, during the siege of Lincoln that followed the Fritz Ranch gunfight, a chaotic skirmish that left Regulator Frank McNabb dead and Ab Saunders badly wounded. As the battle raged, George Coe, perched atop Alexander McSween's home, spotted Cruling across the valley. Lifting his rifle, Coe lined up what witnesses later called a miraculous shot over 350 yards, a near impossible distance with frontier iron sights. He pulled the trigger and the bullet struck home. Dutch Charlie Cruling fell, seriously wounded, the Regulators shouting in triumph as one of the house's hardest guns went down. After that, Cruling disappeared from history. No records confirmed whether he lived or died of his wound, only that his name never resurfaced once the Lincoln County War ended. Like so many who fought under Murphy and Dolan's banner, he simply vanished into the dust, one more gunman swallowed by the aftermath of the war he helped fight. The verdict of time? Dutch Charlie Cruling was a product of the Lincoln County War's chaos, a fighter without fame, fortune, or forgiveness. He wasn't remembered for who he was, but for the shot that took him down. In a conflict where every man thought he was untouchable, Cruling's fall reminded them all no one in Lincoln County was out of range. The story of the house isn't about good men and bad men. It's about what happens when ambition outgrows morality, when money replaces mercy, and when power unchecked, unchallenged, and unrelenting turns a county into a battlefield. From the beginning, Lawrence Murphy and James Dolan saw Lincoln County not as a home, but as a kingdom. They controlled the stores, the banks, the land, and the law itself. Their word was business, their business was law, and for a while, it worked. But the frontier has a way of pushing back. When John Tunstall and Alexander McSween rode into town, they weren't just opening a rival store, they were threatening an empire. And empires, when cornered, don't compromise, they crush. That's when the house unleashed its army. Jesse Evans and his crew, the Boys. Men who lived by the gun and died by it faster. The Seven Rivers Warriors. Outlaws with badges, rustlers with deputy stars. Men who blurred the line between law and murder. The John Kinney Gang. Professional killers for hire who brought military precision to frontier violence. And behind them all, men like Murphy, Dolan, and Riley, counting profits while others counted bodies. Each name we've spoken tonight was another brick in that bloody empire. Buck Morton and Frank Baker, who killed for the house and paid for it in kind. Tom Hill, who may have fired the first shot that ignited the war. Buckshot Roberts, the man who wanted out but couldn't escape the chaos that found him. Bob Beckwith, Charlie Crawford, and Dutch Charlie Cruling, soldiers of fortune who traded their lives for someone else's power. When it was over, Lincoln wasn't a town, it was a scar. Buildings burned, men buried, families scattered, and reputations shattered beyond repair. The men of the house had won battles, but they had lost everything that mattered. Murphy was dying, Dolan's fortune collapsing, and the county itself left in ruin. Their greed had devoured them, brick by brick, deal by deal, bullet by bullet. And yet their story lingers because it's not just a tale from the Old West. It's a reminder, etched in dust and gunpowder. That power, once taken by force, always ends in blood. The Lincoln County War wasn't legend born of lawlessness. It was born of control, of men trying to own a land that refused to be owned. Every shot fired in those canyons echoed far beyond New Mexico. It became part of the larger American story, a story of greed, loyalty, and how far men will go to protect what they think is theirs. And though most of those men are long gone, their ghosts still whisper in the wind over Lincoln County's old Main Street. You can still feel the weight of their choices, their ambition, their arrogance, and the price they paid for both. Next time on Gallows and Gunfights, we'll continue our descent into the darker corners of the house. We'll meet the lieutenants, the shooters, and the survivors, men who carried the cause forward when the empire began to crumble. Because in the West, the fight never ended, it just changed hands. You can buy loyalty, you can buy the law, but you cannot buy peace. Not in Lincoln County, not in this lifetime. Keep your powder dry and your conscience cleaner than theirs. That closes today's case on the house, the empire that tried to own Lincoln County and everyone in it. Greed built it, loyalty bled for it, and history never let it rest.
If you've been riding with us through this story, make sure to like, follow, and share the show wherever you're listening. It helps more folks find their way into the courtroom of history.
Leave us a rating and a review, too. Every review helps us climb the charts and keeps these stories of the American frontier alive for the next listener looking for the truth, grit, and justice.
Follow the Dark Dialogue Network on Facebook, X, YouTube, and Substack for updates, behind-the-scenes posts, and upcoming episodes from all of our shows.
Your support, your likes, shares, and reviews are what keep this community strong. So saddle up, spread the word, and help us keep the legends talking and the guilty answering. You can continue your support on Patreon or on Ko-fi. Your support is how we're able to continue to do this work.
Next time, we'll keep digging into the men who fought for the house and the ghosts they left behind.
Until then, keep your powder dry, your aim true, and your conscience clear, because the jury of history never adjourns. Let the past take the stand and the guilty face the gallows.